The autumn light filtered through Maple Leaf Cafe's windows as Michelle Reynolds adjusted her grey blazer, fingers unconsciously twisting the rose quartz bracelet that never left her wrist. 3 hours from Boston to Cedar Hills, Vermont, all for a blind date she'd never imagined would matter. A blur of chocolate curls and bright sneakers suddenly crashed into her corner table, sending her untouched latte splashing across the wooden surface. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, bent down to retrieve Michelle's fallen bracelet, her small hands delicate as she lifted the pink stone. "This is so pretty! Like magic!" she whispered, innocent eyes meeting Michelle's with startling intensity. A man in a dark sweater rushed over, face flushed with embarrassment. "Sophia, don't bother the nice lady," he said gently, but when his warm eyes met Michelle's, something shifted between them. What happened 3 hours later would haunt Michelle for weeks, because as she knelt down to say goodbye, little Sophia looked up with tears streaming and whispered the words that would shatter everything. "You're my real mum." But how could a 6-year-old stranger know something Michelle had buried so deep, she'd almost convinced herself it never happened? Michelle studied the man as he approached. David Parker, according to the dating profile that had caught her attention with its honest simplicity. 35, physical therapist, single father. What the profile hadn't captured was the way he moved with quiet confidence, or how his dark hair caught the afternoon light, or the gentle way he placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. He wore dark jeans and white sneakers that looked carefully maintained, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a man who understood responsibility. The cafe around them buzzed with the comfortable murmur of small-town life, so different from the aggressive energy of Boston boardrooms. "I'm so sorry about that," David said, extending his hand toward Michelle, as Sophia reluctantly handed back the bracelet. "You must be Michelle. I'm David, and this little hurricane is Sophia." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made Michelle realize how rarely she encountered that kind of authenticity in her corporate circles. She'd expected awkwardness, the usual first-date dance of carefully curated personalities, but instead found herself genuinely curious about this man who'd brought his daughter to meet a stranger. The blazer suddenly felt too formal, too much like armor she didn't need here. "It's perfectly fine," Michelle heard herself saying, surprised by how natural her voice sounded. She'd been practicing casual conversation during the drive, but now the words came easily. "She has excellent taste in jewelry." Sophia beamed at the compliment, and Michelle felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. The little girl's enthusiasm reminded her of something precious, something she'd trained herself not to think about during business hours or late-night work sessions or any of the 1,000 small moments when memory threatened to surface. David's expression softened as he watched the interaction between his daughter and this elegant woman who'd agreed to meet him despite having every reason to stay in her successful city life. "Would you like to join us? Sophia was just about to order her famous chocolate chip pancakes, and I have a feeling she'd love some company." The invitation felt like more than politeness. It felt like an opening to something Michelle hadn't realized she'd been missing. The rose quartz bracelet caught the light as she nodded, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't immediately think of the matching one that would never again grace another small wrist. Michelle slipped off her blazer and draped it over the chair, revealing a cream-colored blouse that made her look softer, more approachable. David noticed the change immediately, the way her shoulders relaxed as she settled into the booth across from them. Sophia had already claimed the spot beside Michelle, chattering about the different types of pancakes available while studying her new companion with the unfiltered curiosity that only children possess. There was something about this child's unreserved warmth that felt familiar in a way that both comforted and unsettled Michelle, as if she were remembering a language she'd once spoken fluently but had forced herself to forget. "So you drove all the way from Boston just to meet my dad?" Sophia asked, her fork creating abstract art with the syrup on her plate while Michelle sipped coffee that actually tasted like coffee, not the bitter corporate fuel she'd grown accustomed to. There was something refreshingly direct about the child's curiosity, and Michelle found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. David apologized for bringing Sophia, explaining that his usual babysitter had cancelled last minute, but Michelle surprised herself by admitting she preferred it this way. The corporate world had taught her to compartmentalize, to keep personal and professional separate, but here in this small cafe, those boundaries seemed unnecessary. "Your dad seemed interesting," Michelle replied, catching David's amused expression over his daughter's head. "And I needed a break from the city." It was more honesty than she'd planned to offer, but something about this little family unit made her usual professional guards feel unnecessary. She watched David automatically cut Sophia's pancakes into smaller pieces, his movements efficient and caring, and noticed how he kept napkins within easy reach without making it obvious. These were the actions of a man who'd learned to anticipate needs, to provide care without fanfare. Sophia studied Michelle with the unfiltered intensity that only children possess. Her head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You smell like flowers," she announced matter-of-factly, then added with 6-year-old logic, "I like flowers. Daddy says my first mum liked flowers too, but she couldn't take care of me, so I live with Daddy now." The casual way she shared this information made Michelle's chest tighten unexpectedly. She found herself unconsciously touching her rose quartz bracelet, a gesture that had become automatic whenever emotions threatened to surface. The stone felt warm against her skin, as if it had absorbed years of nervous energy and careful control. "That sounds like you have a very good daddy," Michelle managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She glanced at David, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of pride and protective concern. There was a story there, she realized. Layers of experience that had shaped this quiet man into someone who could navigate single parenthood with such apparent grace. She'd dated successful men before, corporate climbers who spoke in quarterly projections and networking opportunities, but there was something different about David's quiet competence that intrigued her. He wore his responsibilities like a comfortable sweater, warm and unassuming. "Daddy, can Michelle come home with us? I want to show her my coloring books," Sophia announced with the fearless invitation of childhood. Michelle expected David to deflect politely, but instead, he met her eyes with a question that seemed to ask more than just about coloring books. "If you'd like," he said simply. "Sophia makes excellent artistic choices, and I promise the coffee at home is even better than this." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and the kind of spontaneous decision Michelle hadn't made in years. Her usual schedule was planned weeks in advance, every moment accounted for and optimized. But something about David's quiet confidence made her want to deviate from the plan. As they walked to David's modest blue Honda, Sophia slipped her small hand into Michelle's without asking permission, a gesture so natural that Michelle almost forgot to breathe. The little girl chatted about her art supplies and her favorite colors, while Michelle found herself responding with genuine interest rather than polite adult engagement. The afternoon sun caught the highlights in Sophia's curls, and Michelle had to look away from the resemblance that seemed to hover just at the edge of recognition. David walked beside them, occasionally interjecting with gentle corrections or additions to Sophia's animated commentary, his presence steady and reassuring. David's house was a small 2-story colonial with yellow shutters and a front porch that suggested Sunday mornings and unhurried conversations. Inside, the walls displayed an impressive gallery of Sophia's artwork, everything from finger paintings to more sophisticated drawings that showed real artistic development. Michelle found herself genuinely studying each piece, noting the progression of skill and the consistent theme of families and flowers that ran through the child's work. The house smelled of coffee and something indefinably homey, maybe vanilla or cinnamon, creating an atmosphere that was the complete opposite of Michelle's minimalist Boston apartment with its carefully curated art and sterile surfaces. "Sophia's quite the artist," Michelle observed, pausing at a drawing of a house with 3 figures standing in front of it, 2 adults and a small child. The picture was labeled "My Family" in careful first-grade handwriting, though Michelle noticed the adult figures were drawn in different colors, as if Sophia wasn't quite sure how they should look. David followed her gaze, and his expression became carefully neutral, the kind of protective blankness that parents develop when navigating sensitive topics. There were layers here, Michelle realized, stories that hadn't been shared and wounds that were still healing. "She has a very active imagination," David said quietly, then redirected the conversation towards safer ground. "Coffee? I roast my own beans. It's probably my one claim to sophistication." As he moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, Michelle noticed the small details that spoke of a life built around a child's needs. Art supplies organized in clear containers, a step stool positioned perfectly for little hands to reach the sink, and photographs that showed the progression of Sophia's growth, but notably excluded any images of another adult. The refrigerator was covered with school papers and appointment reminders, the organized chaos of active parenting. Sophia appeared with an enormous box of crayons and several coloring books, her face bright with the prospect of sharing her favorite activity. "This one is my best book," she announced, opening to a page depicting a mother and daughter baking together. "I always make the mummy have long hair like yours." Michelle felt her breath catch as she looked at the page where Sophia had carefully colored the mother figure with brown hair and what appeared to be a pink bracelet on her wrist. The resemblance was probably coincidental, but it felt like a message from somewhere beyond logic, a sign that she wasn't supposed to ignore. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Michelle managed, her voice softer than usual. She accepted the crayon Sophia offered and began coloring with more concentration than the task required, using the familiar motion to steady herself against the unexpected wave of emotion. She'd avoided children's activities for 3 years, had trained herself to walk past toy stores and change the channel when commercials featured families. But here she was, sitting cross-legged on a living room floor, helping a 6-year-old color princesses and feeling more genuine peace than she'd experienced in months. The simple act of staying within the lines felt like meditation, a return to a simpler time when happiness could be found in a box of 64 crayons. David brought coffee and mismatched mugs that somehow felt more welcoming than any fine china, and settled on the couch where he could watch both his daughter and their unexpected guest. "You're good with her," he said quietly, his observation carrying a note of surprise that made Michelle wonder what kind of women he usually dated. "It comes naturally to you." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed ready to explore fully. But Michelle found herself hoping he couldn't hear how fast her heart was beating at the simple acknowledgement. She'd built her career on being good at things, but this felt different, less like a skill and more like a remembering. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting golden shadows through the living room windows, Sophia moved closer to Michelle on the floor, eventually leaning against her side with the unconscious trust of childhood. Michelle tensed for just a moment before allowing herself to relax into the contact, her arm naturally curving around the little girl's shoulders. "You're warm," Sophia murmured contentedly, "and you make me feel safe, like in my good dreams." The innocent observation hit Michelle like a physical blow, beautiful and painful in equal measure, and she had to close her eyes against the sudden intensity of feeling like she'd found something she'd been looking for without knowing she was searching. The discovery came accidentally when Michelle's phone buzzed with a work email and the screen lit up, displaying her lock screen wallpaper for just a moment before she quickly turned it face down, but not quickly enough. David had seen the image, a little girl with curly brown hair and a bright smile, someone who shared enough features with Sophia to make the resemblance unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The silence that followed felt heavy with unasked questions, and Michelle could feel David's therapist training kicking in, the careful way he was processing what he'd observed without immediately demanding explanations. "Who was that?" David asked gently, his voice carrying the professional neutrality he'd probably learned in graduate school. Michelle's hand moved instinctively to her rose quartz bracelet, twisting it in a motion that had become automatic whenever her carefully constructed emotional walls threatened to crack. "No one," she said too quickly, the denial sounding unconvincing even to her own ears. "Just no one important." But her voice caught on the lie, and she saw David's expression shift from casual curiosity to professional concern. He'd recognized the telltale signs of someone carrying grief, the particular kind of careful control that came from protecting a wound that had never quite healed. Sophia, with the intuitive awareness that children possess for adult tension, moved closer to Michelle and asked with innocent directness, "Is that your little girl? She looks like she could be my sister." The observation was delivered with 6-year-old logic, but it hit Michelle like a punch to the chest. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her coffee mug, and made a vague excuse about needing air while David watched with growing understanding in his eyes. The walls of the cozy house suddenly felt too close, the warmth too intimate, the whole situation too much like the life she'd lost and never allowed herself to mourn properly. Standing on the front porch with autumn evening closing around her, Michelle tried to rebuild the emotional barriers that had kept her functional for 3 years, but Sophia appeared beside her, small and concerned, carrying a sweater that was obviously David's draped over her shoulders like a protective cape. "Are you sad about your little girl?" she asked with the kind of directness that adults spend decades learning to avoid. "Daddy says sometimes people get sad about people they love, and that's okay, but hugs help." Before Michelle could respond, small arms wrapped around her waist with fierce affection, and she found herself accepting comfort from a child who barely knew her, but who seemed to understand grief in a way that most adults couldn't manage. When David appeared in the doorway, his expression was careful and knowing, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. "Sophia, why don't you go get ready for your bath?" he suggested gently, and after the little girl reluctantly released Michelle and headed inside, he moved to stand beside her on the porch. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly, "but if you want to, I'm good at listening." The offer was made without pressure, but with the kind of professional compassion that made Michelle realize there was more to David Parker than small-town physical therapy and single parenthood. His training showed in the way he gave her space while still offering support, the delicate balance of someone who understood trauma. The words came out in a rush once Michelle started talking, 3 years of carefully contained grief spilling over the barriers she'd built around her heart. Emma, 5 years old, a gymnastics class on a rainy Thursday evening that had ended in twisted metal and sirens, and the kind of silence that follows catastrophic loss. "I was driving," Michelle said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I keep thinking that if I'd left 5 minutes later, or taken a different route, or if I'd just said no to one more tumbling class." The guilt hung between them like a living thing, fed by 3 years of what-ifs and self-recrimination. David listened without interrupting, his presence steady and grounding as Michelle finally spoke the words she'd been carrying alone. She told him about the successful business she'd built as a monument to staying busy, about the charitable donations she made to children's organizations from a safe distance, and about the rose quartz bracelet that had been Emma's favorite piece of jewelry, the one Michelle wore every day as both memorial and self-inflicted wound. "I bought us matching ones," she admitted, her thumb working over the smooth stone. "She said they would keep us connected even when we were apart. I never imagined how literally that would come true." "Sophia reminds me of her," Michelle admitted, the confession feeling both liberating and terrifying. "The way she moves, the way she trusts so easily, it's like seeing a ghost of what Emma might have become." She expected David to back away, to recognize the dangerous emotional territory they were entering, but instead he moved closer, his presence offering the kind of silent support that spoke of experience with grief and healing. His own losses were written in the careful way he'd arranged his life around Sophia's needs, the single parent's constant balancing act between protection and allowing growth. "I can see why this would be hard," David said carefully, "but you have to know that Sophia's attachment to you isn't about replacing anyone. Kids recognize authentic caring, and whatever you're giving her is real, not some projection of loss." His words carried the weight of professional knowledge, and Michelle realized that David's understanding of child psychology went deeper than she'd initially recognized. There was a story there too, she understood now, layers of training and experience that had prepared him for moments like this. The way he'd handled Sophia's casual mention of her first mom spoke of practice with difficult conversations. The crisis call came at 7 in the morning, Michelle's assistant's voice tight with panic as she explained the overnight scandal that was threatening to destroy everything Michelle had built. A competitor had leaked confidential client information, spinning it into a narrative that painted Mind Body Connect as exploitative and dishonest, and the board was demanding Michelle's immediate return to Boston to manage the fallout. 3 major clients had already called emergency meetings, and the business press was circulating stories that could end her career if not addressed immediately. The professional world Michelle had constructed as a refuge from personal pain was crumbling, demanding her full attention at the worst possible moment. "I have to go," Michelle told David, her professional persona snapping into place like armor as she gathered her things from the guest room where she'd spent the night after their emotional conversation. But as she moved toward the door, Sophia appeared in her pajamas, small and vulnerable in the morning light, her face crumpling with the kind of abandonment fear that spoke of too many goodbyes in her short life. The little girl had obviously been listening from the stairs, her child's understanding picking up on the finality in Michelle's voice and movement. "Don't leave me!" Sophia cried, throwing herself against Michelle's legs with desperate intensity. "Please don't leave like my first mom did!" The words hit like physical blows, and Michelle found herself kneeling to meet the child's eyes, her own heart breaking as she recognized the pattern she was about to perpetuate. In trying to protect herself from further attachment, she was about to inflict the kind of casual abandonment that had already wounded this little girl too many times. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd lost a child was now abandoning another one, completing a cycle of pain that served no one. David appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of understanding and protective anger as he took in the scene. "This is exactly why I don't do this," he said, his voice controlled but edged with frustration. "Kids get attached too quickly and then adults leave when things get complicated." The accusation was gentle but unmistakable, and Michelle felt the weight of every emotional wall she'd built, every relationship she'd avoided, every moment she'd chosen safety over connection. His words stung because they were true, because she was doing exactly what she'd always done when emotions threatened to overwhelm her careful control. "I didn't plan this," Michelle said defensively, standing with Sophia still clinging to her legs. "I never meant for her to get attached." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were inadequate, a professional's attempt to deflect responsibility for the very human connection she'd allowed to develop. The truth was messier and more frightening. She had wanted Sophia's affection, had needed the child's uncomplicated love in ways she was only beginning to understand. The little girl's trust had filled a hole in her heart that she'd convinced herself was permanently sealed. David's training as a therapist was evident in his response, measured and careful despite his obvious anger. "But you did let her get attached. You responded to her like a mother would. You let her call you by pet names. You made her feel safe and then decided to disappear when it became inconvenient." His words were like surgical instruments, precise and cutting, exposing the selfishness Michelle hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from pain that she'd ignored the pain she might cause others, especially someone as vulnerable as a 6-year-old who'd already experienced too much loss. The argument escalated as Michelle's phone continued buzzing with urgent messages, and David's protective instincts overrode his usual diplomatic restraint. "Maybe you're right," Michelle finally said, her voice breaking as she gently disentangled herself from Sophia's grip. "Maybe I should just stick to sending checks to charity instead of getting involved. It's easier than actually caring." The words tasted bitter even as she spoke them, but they felt safer than admitting how much this little family had come to mean to her in just 2 days. The corporate world had taught her that emotional distance was professional, that caring too much was a weakness to be managed. "Yeah, maybe you should," David replied, his own pain evident beneath the anger. "It's easier than taking responsibility for the hearts you break along the way." The conversation had moved beyond rational discussion into the territory of mutual wounds, each word chosen to inflict maximum damage while protecting their own vulnerabilities. Michelle recognized the pattern from her own grief counseling, the way people pushed away connection when it threatened to heal them, when the risk of loving again felt too dangerous to contemplate. As Michelle gathered her things with trembling hands, Sophia made one last, desperate attempt to prevent the abandonment she saw coming. "Mommy Michelle," she whispered, the title falling from her lips with devastating innocence. "I promise I'll be good if you stay. I won't ask for too much. I won't make you sad like the picture on your phone. Please don't go." The words shattered something fundamental in Michelle's chest, the careful emotional architecture she'd built crumbling under the weight of a child's pure love and trust. The fact that Sophia was willing to make herself smaller, to ask for less, to somehow fix whatever was wrong, made Michelle's departure feel like the cruelest kind of betrayal. Michelle knelt one final time, taking Sophia's hands in hers as she tried to find words that wouldn't add to the damage she was about to cause. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have to make hard choices, even when those choices hurt. But you're going to be okay, because you have the best daddy in the world, and he loves you more than anything." She pressed a gentle kiss to Sophia's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood shampoo and innocence, then stood and walked toward her car without looking back, knowing that if she met David's eyes, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. 3 weeks in Boston felt like 3 months, each day blurring into the next as Michelle threw herself into damage control with the kind of manic energy that had built her company but couldn't fill the unexpected emptiness in her daily routine. She worked 18-hour days, fielded calls from reporters and investors, and slowly rebuilt the professional reputation that had taken years to establish. But success felt hollow in ways it never had before, and she found herself distracted by memories of coloring books and chocolate chip pancakes and small hands trusting her completely. The corner office that had once felt like a throne now seemed like a prison, its glass walls offering a view of a city that no longer felt like home. The panic attack came during a board meeting, triggered by a colleague's casual mention of their daughter's art class. Michelle found herself gasping for air in the executive bathroom, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she realized she'd been holding her breath for weeks, waiting for a phone call or text that never came. She'd abandoned a child who'd already experienced too much loss, and the professional victory of saving her company felt like ashes compared to the personal failure of breaking a little girl's heart. The rose quartz bracelet felt heavier on her wrist, no longer a comfort but a reminder of all the ways she'd failed to honor Emma's memory. The report arrived when Michelle finally asked her assistant to research David and Sophia, a violation of privacy that she justified as concern but knew was really about her own need to know they were okay. David's background included a master's degree in child psychology, alongside his physical therapy certification, years of volunteer work with foster children, and a history of quiet, charitable involvement that mirrored her own instinct to help from a distance. Sophia's file showed a little girl who'd been in the system for 2 years before David and his late wife Sarah had adopted her, providing the stability and love that had allowed her to bloom into the confident, artistic child Michelle had met. But it was David's recent social media posts that broke Michelle's heart completely. Photos of Sophia looking thin and listless, refusing to engage with her art supplies, asking daily when Mommy Michelle was coming back. David's posts were carefully neutral, but Michelle could read the worry in every image, the concerned father trying to help his daughter process another abandonment while managing his own complex feelings about the woman who'd walked away. The pictures showed a child who'd retreated into herself, the bright energy that had first caught Michelle's attention dimmed by disappointment and confusion. The turning point came when Michelle found herself standing outside Emma's memorial garden at sunset, a small space she'd created behind their old house but hadn't visited in over a year. As she knelt beside the marker stone and fresh flowers she'd had delivered weekly for 3 years, she finally spoke aloud the words she'd been avoiding. "I found a little girl who needed me, Em, and I ran away because loving her felt like betraying you. But I think you'd want me to go back. You'd want me to try again." The evening air was still, as if the universe was listening, waiting for her to make the choice that would define the rest of her life. The drive to Cedar Hills took 4 hours, during which Michelle rehearsed and discarded dozens of apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. She'd closed the biggest deal in her company's history that morning, but all she could think about was whether David would even let her see Sophia, whether she'd damaged the trust too badly to repair. The rose quartz bracelet on her wrist felt heavier than usual, weighted with the memory of Emma's excitement when they'd bought matching pairs, and with the knowledge that she'd given one to another little girl who deserved better than abandonment. She found them at the small playground behind Sophia's school, David pushing his daughter on a swing with the patient repetition of a parent trying to coax smiles from a grieving child. Sophia looked smaller than Michelle remembered, her usual bright energy dimmed in a way that made Michelle's chest ache with recognition of damage done. When the little girl saw her approaching, she went very still, as if afraid that movement might make the vision disappear. The wariness in those young eyes was like a knife to Michelle's heart, evidence of trust broken and innocence wounded. "Mommy Michelle," Sophia whispered, her voice carrying 3 weeks of hope and disappointment. "Are you real, or am I dreaming again?" The question was a knife to Michelle's heart, evidence of a child who'd learned not to trust good things to last. Michelle knelt in the wood chips beside the swing, meeting Sophia's eyes with all the honesty she could manage. The playground around them was empty except for the sound of wind through autumn leaves, creating a quiet space for the conversation that would determine their future. "I'm real, baby," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the tears she couldn't control. "And if you'll forgive me, if your daddy will let me, I'd like to try very hard to stay real in your life." David stopped pushing the swing, his expression unreadable as he watched his daughter's face transform with cautious joy. The conversation that followed was quiet and careful, full of apologies and tentative promises, but underneath it all was the recognition that some connections are worth fighting for, even when they're complicated, even when they require more courage than seems possible. 6 months later, Michelle woke to the sound of pancakes sizzling in the kitchen, and Sophia's laughter floating up the stairs of the small apartment she'd rented 3 blocks from David's house. The arrangement was unconventional. A successful CEO who'd relocated her company's operations to support a small-town life, a single father learning to trust again, and a little girl who'd gained not a replacement mother, but an additional source of love and stability in her expanding world. The morning routine had become a cherished ritual that grounded all 3 of them in the simple pleasure of shared domesticity. Michelle would arrive at 7 with fresh fruit and coffee beans, Sophia would present her latest artwork for admiration, and David would orchestrate breakfast with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to find joy in ordinary moments. Michelle wore jeans and a soft sweater instead of business attire, her rose quartz bracelet catching the morning light as she helped Sophia measure pancake batter. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but gradually, like a season changing, she'd learned to value different kinds of success, the kind measured in bedtime stories and homework help, rather than quarterly profits. "Can we put blueberries in mine?" Sophia asked, standing on her step stool to peer into the mixing bowl. "And can we make them look like flowers for Emma?" The casual inclusion of Emma in their daily conversations had become natural over the months, Michelle's gradual sharing of memories, allowing Sophia to understand that love could expand rather than replace, that honoring someone who was gone didn't diminish love for someone present. The little girl had accepted Emma as a kind of invisible sister, someone who watched over them and would have loved her if they'd had the chance to meet. David watched from across the kitchen, flipping pancakes with one hand while sipping coffee from the mug Sophia had made him in art class, lopsided and painted with stick figures representing their small family. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations, moments when Michelle's grief intersected unexpectedly with daily life, and times when David's protective instincts clashed with Michelle's impulse to spoil Sophia with experiences and opportunities. But they'd found their rhythm through patience and honest communication, building something that looked nothing like a traditional family but felt exactly like home. Sunday mornings had become their sacred time, the 3 of them walking to the small cemetery where Michelle had placed a memorial stone for Emma among the old maples and granite markers. Sophia would bring flowers from David's garden and chatter to the stone about school and art projects and the new bedroom Michelle was helping her design. The conversations were natural and healing, allowing grief and joy to coexist in the way that only children seem to understand instinctively. These visits had become less about mourning and more about celebration, about including Emma in their ongoing story, rather than leaving her behind. Standing in the kitchen, as autumn light filtered through windows that had become familiar, Michelle marveled at the unexpected path that had led her here. The successful business she'd built in Boston now operated primarily from her home office in Vermont, serving clients who appreciated her unique perspective on work-life balance and authentic leadership. She discovered that success could be redefined, that influence could be measured in pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories as much as quarterly profits and market share. The corporate world still called, but it no longer defined her worth or her identity. As they sat down to breakfast together, Sophia chatted about the art show planned for the following week, where 3 of her paintings would be displayed alongside those of older students. Michelle and David had both promised to attend, along with what Sophia proudly called all my grandparents, the collection of elderly neighbors and family friends who'd adopted their small unit as their own project, bringing casseroles and babysitting offers and the kind of community support that made small-town life work. The morning stretched ahead of them with comfortable predictability: grocery shopping and homework help, a visit to the library where David volunteered reading to younger children, and the evening ritual of cooking dinner together while Sophia worked on art projects at the kitchen table. Looking across the table at Sophia's syrup-sticky smile and David's quiet contentment, Michelle understood that healing hadn't come through forgetting or replacing what she'd lost, but through learning that love could multiply infinitely when shared generously. Emma would always be part of her story, but now that story included new chapters written in coloring books and pancake breakfasts, and the daily miracle of a child who'd taught her that family could be chosen as well as born, that home could be built from hope as much as history. The rose quartz bracelet on her wrist caught the morning light. No longer a weight of grief, but a bridge between past and present, between the love she'd lost and the love she'd found again.